Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to a new video of mine with a new lecture on a new topic related to a famous 19th century English poet named S.T Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, right? And the topic of the lecture today would be Coleridge's supernaturalism, right? What are the chief characteristics of the supernaturalism of S.T Coleridge? This is what we are going to discuss in today's lecture. But before beginning the topic, let's have an introduction to the topic. As you know that S.T Coleridge is a very famous English poet and a critic of 19th century English literature. He contributed a lot towards 19th century English poetry as well as 19th century English criticism, right? S.T Coleridge is the pioneer of 19th century romantic movement along with William Wordsworth. So he was the man, S.T Coleridge was the man who initiated 19th century romantic movement in the history of English literature. And in this way, he started off an altogether new type of a literature, which was a kind of a revolt against the new classicism of Alexander Pope and John Dryden of 18th century. Right? Let's have some discussion about the supernaturalism of S.T Coleridge. Before Coleridge came into the field of writing poetry, there was supernaturalism in English literature even in the 18th century. Although 18th century is known for its reason, its intellectualism, its dominance of reason, still even in this age of reason and intellect, there was a strong note of supernaturalism running through English literature. This supernaturalism in 18th century was largely reflected by a type of novel, a certain type of novel being written by certain novelists. And the name of this novel was Gothic novel. Gothic novel was an 18th century novel which had a strong note of supernaturalism. And the major exponents of this type of novel were Anne Radcliffe, Clara Reeve, and Lewis Monk. These were the three famous writers who produced Gothic novel. You know, what was the problem with this Gothic novel, the supernaturalism of this Gothic novel? The problem was the supernaturalism of this novel was crude one. It was not sophisticated one. It was not refined one. It did not appeal, as a result of it, it did not appeal to refined mind, sophisticated mind, civilized mind. As a result of that, the supernaturalism of, because of its crudeness, because of its lack of refinement, it failed. Before S.T Coleridge came into the field of writing supernatural kind of English poetry. And Coleridge learnt a lot from the supernaturalism of 18th century, that what to do in order to make his supernaturalism be successful in English poetry, right? He understood that the supernaturalism of 18th century failed because it was too crude to be realistic, to be acceptable to the realistic mind of 18th century reader. For this purpose, for the acceptance of his supernaturalism in his poetry, S.T Coleridge adopted certain techniques, certain methods in order to make his supernaturalism acceptable to the 19th century English reader. For this purpose, he used five major techniques in order to achieve the willing suspension of disbelief on the part of the reader, which is so crucial to make his supernaturalism acceptable to the reader. So, for this purpose, he uses five techniques. First important technique that Coleridge employs in order to make his supernaturalism acceptable to the reader is that he sets his scenes in distant times and remote places. The scenes and the settings and the backgrounds that are there in his supernatural poetry, they are set by S.T Coleridge in remote times and remote places, 100 times removed from current life. This really helps S.T Coleridge to win the faith of the reader in order to make him believe that what he is telling them is not supernatural, it is natural. Right? For example, in the poem Kubla Khan, famous poem Kubla Khan, S.T Coleridge sets the scene of this poem, sets the background of this poem in the medieval China. Medieval China is a far off setting. It's 100 times removed from the current times, which is 19th century, the age in which S.T Coleridge produced poetry. This remoteness of the scene, of the setting of Kubla Khan helps S.T Coleridge to make his reader believe in what he is telling is true. Right? Because reader does not know anything about the scene or the setting of medieval China. As a result of that, he readily accepts whatever is told to him in the form of supernaturalism in the poem Kubla Khan. So this remoteness of the setting, the distance of the setting from contemporaneity, from current times of S.T Coleridge or the reader, helps S.T Coleridge to win the faith, confidence, belief of the reader for his shadows of imagination in his poetry. Shadows of imagination mean supernaturalism, which is there in his poetry. So this is the first important technique that Coleridge employs in order to achieve willing suspension of disbelief on the part of the reader, in order to make his reader believe in his supernaturalism as naturalism. This is the example of Kubla Khan. Take the example of his another famous poem called Christabel. The setting of this poem, the scene of this poem is set in medieval England, far off England, which is 100 times removed from current England. Right? So he selects the setting or background of this poem, which is located somewhere in the deep past of England. So whatever he tells about theme of this particular poem, the story of this particular poem, the events and incidents of this particular poem in Christabel, reader readily accepts. This gradual introduction of the supernaturalism is there in all the major poems of S.T Coleridge. Take the example of the poem Christabel. In the poem Christabel, in the beginning of this poem, Coleridge talks about natural things, natural environment, and then he drops a hint of supernaturalism. And this dropping of supernaturalism is in the form of the changing of the color of the eye of Geraldine, right? He drops the hint that there is something fishy about Geraldine, that there is something supernatural about Geraldine. He wants to hint at the fact that Geraldine is not a human being. She is a witch. She is a supernatural being. So, this hint is dropped by S.T Coleridge in the very beginning of the poem, in the natural environment. Largely in the beginning, environment is natural. But in this naturalism, he drops the hint of supernaturalism. He shows in the light of a flame the changing color of the eye of Geraldine. Reader here realizes that there is something, dubious, there is something suspicious about Geraldine, that she might be a witch, she might be some supernatural being. So this is how he, slowly and gradually introduces supernaturalism, but he does not introduce it suddenly and quickly in the beginning of the poem. So this is how he refines his supernaturalism. He minuses his supernaturalism of any type of crudeness. So this is another important technique employed by S.T Coleridge in order to naturalize his supernaturalism. And this technique is gradual introduction of the supernaturalism. And this is also an aspect of S.T Coleridge's poetry. Next important aspect of S.T Coleridge's supernatural poetry is subtle blending of the natural and the supernatural. This is another important technique employed by S.T Coleridge in order to naturalize his supernaturalism. It usually happens with S.T Coleridge that whenever he introduces supernaturalism within naturalism, then he binds these two elements of his poetry so subtly that reader does not realize it. Reader does not realize that where naturalism began and where it ended, and from where naturalism, supernaturalism began and how it took off, right? Reader does not realize it. Reader cannot locate the point where Coleridge binds both the elements, naturalism and supernaturalism, subtly, right? This is done by S.T Coleridge in the poem Kubla Khan. This is done by S.T Coleridge in the poem Christabel, and this is also done by S.T Coleridge in his famous poem The Rime of Ancient Mariner. So this is another important technique. This is another important method. This is another important aspect of the supernatural poetry of S.T Coleridge. Next important aspect of S.T Coleridge's supernaturalism is psychological realism, right? Before discussing this psychological realism as an aspect of Coleridge's poetry, let me define what is psychological realism. Psychological realism is psychologically truthful presentation of life as it is, without minusing anything from it and without adding anything into it. This is called psychological realism. This is the technique, this is the realism, type of realism used by S.T Coleridge in order to naturalize his supernaturalism. It usually happens with S.T Coleridge that whenever he is short of conventional realism, then he falls back on his psychological realism and uses it in order to win the faith of the reader for the shadows of imagination that he discusses in his poetry, for the supernaturalism that he discusses in his poetry, right? For example, take the example of the poem Kubla Khan. In the poem Kubla Khan, a warrior listens to a war prophecy. Out of the noise created by the falling of the river Alf into sunless sea. Now, there is a clear-cut psychological realism and psychological linkage between the listener of this prophecy and the prophecy itself. How natural it is, how psychologically true it is that a warrior, a medieval soldier, is listening to nothing else but a prophecy related to a future war out of the noise created by the falling of the river Alf into sunless sea. Right? So, this is how S.T Coleridge, in a supernatural environment, takes the support of psychological realism in order to create a sort of a convincing bridge, linkage between the listener of the prophecy and the prophecy itself. Reader readily believes that Kubla Khan might have listened to a sort of a war prophecy out of that noise created by the falling of the river Alf into sunless sea. So, this is another important technique, this is another important method employed by S.T Coleridge in order to naturalize his supernaturalism. And this technique, this aspect is psychological realism. Last but not the least aspect of S.T Coleridge's supernatural poetry is suggestiveness. This is another important technique used by S.T Coleridge in order to naturalize his supernaturalism. You know what is suggestiveness? Suggestiveness means to tell 25% and hide the 75%. Suggestiveness is a sort of a blank space left by the writer for the imagination of the reader, so that reader can fill it with necessary details, the details of his choice. Suggestiveness is like an iceberg. As it happens with iceberg that 25% of the iceberg is visible on the surface and 75% of the iceberg is concealed under the water. This is suggestiveness as well. In this technique, a writer shows the 25% of the reality and hides the 75% of it. Whatever 75% is concealed or kept hidden from the imagination, it is left to the imagination of the reader, so that reader can imagine the details of his own choice up to 75%. So, it's like a blank space left by the writer for the reader. Right? S.T Coleridge uses this technique.